In the spring of 1985, Dennis Harker received a check from the United States Department of Agriculture for $12,400. He had enrolled 240 acres of his rented corn ground in the Conservation Reserve Program the previous fall, committed to taking those acres out of production for 10 years and maintain in them in permanent grass cover in exchange for annual payments calculated on the county's average cash rent rate for comparable ground. The $12,400 represented the first full year's payment under the enrollment. It arrived as a government check, made out to Dennis Harker at the address he had listed on the enrollment form. He deposited it on a Thursday. He told his wife the CRP check had come through. He marked it in his records as government program income. The letter from Everett Gunderson arrived the following Tuesday. Gunderson owned the 240 acres Dennis had enrolled. Denny S. had been renting the ground from Gunderson since 1978 under a cash rent lease that renewed each year. He was 41 years old in 1985, and those 240 Gunderson acres had been a central part of his operation for the entire decade of his most productive farming years. He farmed 380 acres total, 140 of his own, 240 rented from Gunderson. The owned ground was dryland corn and wheat on lighter soils on the west end of his home farm. The Gunderson ground was heavier, better draining, more consistent in a dry year. It averaged a few bushels per acre more than his own ground in most seasons. He had been among the first in the county to express interest in CRP when the program was announced in late 1984. The Gunderson ground was exactly the kind of acreage the program was designed for, highly erodible in places, marginal in wet years, the kind of field where a permanent grass stand would improve water quality and reduce wind erosion on the exposed knolls. Dennis had attended the county USDA information meeting in January 1985 and had spent the better part of 2 hours with the county agricultural agent, going through the payment rate calculations for different field configurations. 240 acres would generate $12,400 annually. 10 years of guaranteed payments, no crop risk, no input costs on those acres. In the farm economy of 1985, that arithmetic was compelling. He had brought Gunderson into the process early. The program required the landlord's signature, which meant Arson needed to understand what he was consenting to. They had met twice in the fall of 1985. Gunderson was 67 years old and had been renting to Dennis for 7 years without a problem. He had agreed to the enrollment with what Dennis had read at the time as uncomplicated acceptance. They had driven to the USDA county office together and signed the paperwork in October. The lease had been a background document throughout that process. Dennis had not thought to review it before the enrollment. He had not thought to ask Gunderson whether the lease addressed CRP payments. The program knew enough that the question had not been a standard part of anyone's checklist. It was 3 pages. The cash rent was printed clearly on page 1. That was the number Dennis had focused on in November 1978, the number that had determined whether the arrangement made sense. He found section 3 on the second page. It covered payment obligations and miscellaneous income from the premises. Section 3A addressed crop insurance proceeds. Section 3B read as follows: all government payments attributable to the lease premises, including but not limited to any acreage diversion payments, BFOD, ICNC payments, or any other payments made by federal or state agencies in connection with the management, use, or non-use of the premises, shall be shared equally between lessor and LAC. Dennis read it twice. Then he read it a third time. He read the phrase management, use, or non-use of the premises. He read attributable to the leased premises. He read shall be shared equally. The Conservation Reserve Program was a federal payment made in connection with the non-use of the premises. Taking acres out of production was precisely non-use. The phrase attributable to the lease. Premises described the CRP enrollment exactly. The payment had been calculated on the rental rate and soil productivity of the specific 240 acres Gunderson owned, not on any characteristic of Dennis as a farmer. CRP payments are set by reference to what the land rents for in the local market. D. Eland generates the payment rate, not the person who farms it. Section 3(b) said those payments were to be split equally. The clause had been sitting in the lease since November 1978. Congress authorized it as part of the 1985 Farm Bill signed that December. The program was created to address a specific and serious problem. By the mid-1980s, the United States was holding record grain surpluses in government storage facilities, and those surpluses were pushing commodity prices down for every farmer still planting. Something more durable than a one-year emergency measure was needed. CRP was the long-term structural response, a 10-year commitment, funded in each subsequent farm bill, designed to retire tens of millions of acres from production on a voluntary basis, with annual payments competitive enough that farmers would choose non-production over planting. The attorney who had drafted Gunderson's standard lease form in the early 1970s had not been thinking about the Conservation Reserve Program. He had been thinking about the programs that did exist at the time. The acreage reduction program, which required farmers to idle a portion of their crop base as a condition of receiving price support payments. The payment-in-kind program, which had appeared briefly in 1983. The various deficiency payment mechanisms that Congress had put in place under the Farm Bill of that era. Each of those programs sent government money to farmers in connection with what they did or didn't do on their land. The clause the attorney had drafted was broad enough to cover all of them and any others that might emerge. Including but not limited to was the expansive language that a careful draftsman uses when he knows the list he's writing is not exhaustive. Any other payments made by federal or state agencies in connection with the management, use, or non-use of the premises was the catch-all provision. It swept in programs the drafting attorney could not have named. Because those programs did not yet have names, the clause was not a trap. It was standard boilerplate that had been in farm leases across the Great Plains for years. It addressed the reality that federal agricultural programs come and go, change their names and their mechanics, and that a lease intended to renew annually for an indefinite period needed language, broad enough to survive those changes without requiring renegotiation every time Washington revised the Farm Bill. Dennis had signed it in 1978 because the lease was otherwise reasonable and because the annual cash rent figure was the number that mattered to him at the time. He had confirmed the rent amount, scanned the payment terms, and given Section 3 the attention most people give to standard form provisions in a document they expect to function in the background without ever becoming relevant. 7 years of annual renee. Walls had confirmed that expectation. There's a legal question embedded in the CRP payment structure that most farmers who enrolled rented ground in 1985 and 1986 did not stop to examine. Who was receiving a government payment and for what? When a farmer enrolls cropland in the Conservation Reserve Program, the payment rate is calculated by reference to the county's average cash rent for comparable ground. USDA surveys local cash rent markets and sets the CRP payment at a rate competitive with what a landowner would receive from an active tenant. The goal is to make non-production financially comparable to production for the landowner, so that landowners have reason to support rather than resist their tenants' enrollment decisions. In Reno County, Nebraska in 1985, the average cash rent for dryland corn ground was in the range of $50 to $55 per acre annually, depending on soil productivity and drainage. Dennis's enrollment rate had been set at approximately $51.67 per acre for the 240 enrolled acres, producing the $12,400 annual payment at a rate that closely tracked what Gunderson would have received in cash rent if Dennis had been planting corn on that ground instead of letting it go to grass. The payment amount, in other words, was derived from what the land was worth to rent, not from Dennis's management decisions, not from his years of experience or his knowledge of the drainage tiles. The land's rental value in the local market determined that this area number on the government check. Under this classification, CRP payments are attributable to the land. A farmer who enrolls ground he owns receives the full payment. He is the operator and the landowner simultaneously, and the payment compensates for the idling of his own asset. A farmer who enrolls rented ground receives a payment calculated on the same basis, but the land generating that productive capacity, the land whose rental rate determines the payment amount, belongs to someone else. Whether the landlord is entitled to a share of that payment depends on what the lease says. In the mid-1980s, when CRP was new and the legal questions around tenant enrollment of rented land were unresolved, courts in different states reached different conclusions when leases were silent on the subject. Some found that CRP payments belonged entirely to the tenant who enrolled. Others found that TRP payments belonged entirely to the tenant who enrolled. He, landlord, had a claim based on the payment's connection to the land's productive value. The legal uncertainty was real in 1985, and it produced inconsistent outcomes depending on where you were and what your specific lease did or didn't say. If the lease specifically addressed government payments and how they were to be shared, that language controlled. The general legal uncertainty didn't matter. The contract had answered the question for the parties who signed it. Section 3 of Dennis Harker's lease had answered it in November 1978, 7 years before the question arose. There was a more detail that made Dennis's position considerably more difficult. The CRP enrollment process for rented ground required the landlord's signature. The Conservation Reserve Program was a 10-year land use commitment that would prevent the landlord from farming the ground himself, leasing it to anyone else, or making any significant changes to how it was managed during that period. USDA required written landlord consent before it would accept any CRP enrollment on rented land. Gunderson had signed the enrollment paperwork alongside Dennis in the fall of 1985. When Gunderson sat across the table at the USDA county office and signed the enrollment form, he had his lease in mind. His attorney had drafted Section 3B. He knew what it said. He knew that any government payment made in connection with non-use of the premises was to be shared equally. He was signing a form that would rate exactly such a payment, beginning in 1985 and continuing for 10 consecutive years. He signed the form, and then he waited for the first check to arrive. Dennis called a Farm Bureau attorney in Lincoln the week after the letter came. The attorney reviewed the lease and the CRP enrollment in paperwork and gave his assessment without softening it. Section 3B was clear. The CRP payment was a government payment attributable to the leased premises. The language covered it without ambiguity. Gunderson's claim was valid. Then the attorney asked the question Dennis had been hoping would not come up. Were there any prior program payments that would also have been subject to Section 3 and that had not been shared? Dennis thought about 1982. The acreage reduction program that year had required him to idle a portion of his corn base as a condition of receiving deficiency payment. The idled acres had included Gunderson ground. The deficiency payment Dennis had received was a government payment made in connection with the non-use of the leased premises. Section 3B would have applied. Half should have gone to Gunderson. Dennis thought about 1983. He had enrolled a portie of the Gunderson ground in the payment-in-kind program that year, idling those acres in exchange for P-hike certificates he had sold to a broker for $15,200. The P-hike proceeds were a government payment attributable to the leased premises. Section 3B would have applied to those as well. Neither payment had been shared. Dennis had received both amounts, deposited them, and not thought about Section 3B because he had not read Section 3B with the attention it warranted. He had been thinking about the farm, the numbers, the season ahead. The lease was background. Section 3B was boilerplate. The Lincoln attorney told Dennis that Gunderson could potentially seek those prior amounts plus interest if he chose to raise them. Whether Gunderson had tracked the ARP and PIC payments was unclear. The CRP payment was the one large enough and documented enough to bring an attorney into it. The earlier payments had been smaller and quieter. Dennis paid Gunderson the $6,200 within 30 days. He did not raise the subject of 1982 or 1983. Gunderson did not raise it either. The lease continued its annual renewal. The CRP contract ran for 10 years. Each annual payment was split equally. $6,200 to Gunderson, $6,200 to Dennis. Dennis farmed the remaining acreage and adjusted his operating budget accordingly. The 1978 lease clause had been written before the program it ultimately governed existed. This is the essential character of well-drafted contractual language. It does not predict specific programs. It describes categories. Government payments attributable to the leased premises was a category description. The Conservation Reserve Program fell into that category when Congress created it in 1985. The clause did not need to be updated or amended or interpreted expansively. It applied to the CRP payment by its own plain terms, the same way it would have applied to any other program that sent government money in connection with how the leased land was managed or not managed. The 1978 attorney had written language that could outlast the programs he was aware of. The 1985 Congress had created a program that the 1978 attorney had never heard of. The two documents had never been in the same room, authored by people who had never met, but the category the attorney described and the program Congress created were a match. 7 years passed between the clause and the consequence. During those years, the lease renewed quietly each November. Dennis planted and harvested. Gunderson collected his cash rent. Neither of them read Section 3B with the attention the language warranted. Then a $12,400 check arrived. A Tuesday letter followed, and a 3-page document from 1978 became the most important piece of paper on Dennis Harker's desk. 7 years of silence, half the money gone.